Welcome to our weekly Zoom news conference, co-hosted today by the Leadership Conference Education Fund. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Our topic is the fierce fight to secure the freedom to vote. Two key bills are pending in Congress for the PEOPLE Act, or S1, and the John L. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both aimed at setting national standards for voting access and strengthening protection against racial discrimination at the ballot box. At the same time, lawmakers in 47 states have introduced bills to create barriers to voting, which would disproportionately affect voters of color, seniors, students, people with disabilities. Our speakers today all have long histories of working to expand voting access. They will explain what's at stake for ethnic voters as voting battles rage and the chances of passage for the two bills before Congress. Our speakers include John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, Thomas Saenz, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, Hillary Shelton, Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy for the NAACP, Jacqueline De Leon, Staff Attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, Wendy Weiser, Vice President, Democracy of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Many thanks to our speakers, our briefing coordinators, and our interpreters for providing simultaneous interpreting in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. We ask our presenters to speak slowly for our interpreters. If you speak too fast, our moderator may have to interrupt you to ask you to slow down. We invite reporters to please enter your questions in the chat box. We will take questions for each speaker and again at the conclusion of the panel. So now I turn the conference over to today's moderator, Pilar Marrero. Pilar, thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, good Friday to all. This is a topic that is in the news, very much so. And let's go right into it with our first speaker, John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Welcome, Mr. Yang, as always.
Thank you very much, Pilar, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Advancing Justice, AAJC is the voice for the Asian American community, the fastest growing community in the United States, fighting for our civil rights through public policy advocacy, litigation, and education. We serve to empower our communities by bringing local and national constituencies together and ensuring that Asian Americans are able to fully participate in our democracy. We have worked for decades to preserve the voting rights for every eligible American while fighting against voter suppression tactics that impede Asian Americans' access to the ballot box. The For the People Act, or S1, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act are major steps in the right direction to recognize the importance of reducing barriers to voting. Look, we are coming off an historic year that showed Asian Americans and other people of color fighting for solidarity and racial justice, getting community members to fill out our census, getting large numbers of Asian Americans to the ballot box for the presidential election and other down ballot tickets. Registering voters to counting every ballot post-election, the hard work of organizers and advocates should be recognized.
John,
more Asian Americans.
John, can you go just a little more slowly? Sorry.
Sorry,
it's
yes.
More important what you're saying.
Yep, you're right. Thank you. More Asian Americans voted in the 2020 presidential election than in any other election in history. Nationally, there was voter turnout increase of over 40% when compared to the 2016 presidential election. turnout of Asian American voters doubled in 2020 for Texas. And in Arizona, the number of Asian American voters that turned out increased by 80%. These are just examples of how we must strengthen our efforts to protect voting rights for all. We also made history in electing Vice President Kamala Harris, the first Asian and Black female vice president. During the pandemic, the civil rights issues we care deeply about that came to the forefront and highlighted the urgent need, the stark health, economic, and educational disparities all of our communities face. It is thanks to voters that we are now seeing a light at the end of the tunnel of this pandemic. On top of this, Asian Americans have dealt with the dual pandemic of anti-Asian sentiment and hate, which along with racial justice as a whole was a major concern of Asian Americans who voted in this election. Now look, language barriers are one of the biggest impediments to the Asian American vote, with 1/3 of Asian Americans being what is called limited English proficient. In every election, poll monitors have observed missing Asian language signage and interpreters, which limits access to the ballot. Ensuring effective language assistance is paramount to closing that consistent barrier. Through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that has been vital to ensuring language access and assistance to Asian Americans in national and local elections, and for increasing the community's access to the ballot. But more can be done to improve the access to the ballot for limited English proficient Asian American voters. That is what both the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Act does. Without access to the ballot, our community will not be able to maximize its political power. The historic number of Asian American voters is no accident. It is also because of access to automatic voter registration and to access by voting by mail. Both voting rights bills will improve voting opportunities for millions of eligible Americans in communities of color, people with disabilities, and those who have limited English proficiency. As the Asian American population and voter population continues to grow across America, it is our responsibility to fight against attempts to restrict access to the ballot box. Especially,
Mr. Yang, please slower.
oh, sorry.
Interpreting.
Sorry. As the Asian American population and voter population continues to grow across America, it is our responsibility to fight against attempts to restrict access to the ballot box, especially in new geographic areas where there's increased efforts to silence our political voice. There's still much to be done to make the promise of democracy real for everyone in our nation. It will take all of us together in full force to ensure the freedom to vote. Let's make the most of this momentum by giving the people the opportunity to vote without the suppression and get back to a democracy that is truly of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yang. Thank you for that presentation. We don't have any questions yet. Can you update us on what the timeline is for this vote?
I think it's unclear. Well, the For the People Act, that has been passed by the Senate. So now it would go to the House. I don't think a vote has been scheduled yet with respect to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in the Senate yet. So I think part of it is it's a little bit unclear what the timing is. And part of it is our understanding is that there are still some discussions to be had to see where Republicans might end up and how we negotiate this.
It looked like Wendy wanted to say something. Did you want to say something, Wendy?
I could wait until later to respond, but the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, it has not yet been introduced in the House and the Senate. Again, it passed the House in the last Congress, but will be introduced again shortly, likely this summer. And the For the People Act has had passed the House, has had a hearing in the Senate, will be going to markup over the next 2 weeks in the Senate, and the floor vote, we don't know when that will happen.
Okay, it's important to know the timeline. I think as a reporter. Okay, there's a question about Manny Otico. Manny, do you want to ask your question of Mr. Yang? Manny Otico?
Yes, my question is that I don't know if you watched the presentation that President Biden made early in the week before his first 100 days, but during the counter presentation, Tim Scott said that the Georgia law didn't make it harder to vote. So I was just interested in your opinion on that.
I would strongly disagree with that. The Georgia bill limited the right to vote by reducing the number of places where you cast a ballot. It reduced the hours in which people cast a ballot. And so those provisions alone, as well as other provisions about what sort of identification needs to be presented, provides several barriers for the ability of people, especially the most vulnerable people, ability to vote.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yang. Let's move on to our second speaker. Welcome, Mr. Hillary Shelton. Can you unmute? Okay, perfect, because you wasn't sure you could. Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy for the NAACP. Welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be with such important friends and coalition partners as we move to address the issue of how we improve our voting rights, repair the damages that were done to our voting rights as a very reckless approach that we would argue from the Supreme Court. And then, of course, draw on the experiences that we had coming out of this last election. As you know, we had more Americans vote in this last election than any other time in our nation's history. What that means is our folks turned out in record numbers, but still had to struggle with many of the obstacles to voter participation that are still very much with us. It's saddening that we first have to repair the damages done by the Supreme Court to the operation of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which of course is one of the issues in the bills that we're talking about. Even as we knew prior to the Supreme Court striking down that important pre-clearance provision, that there were other things we were trying to strengthen to make sure that as America moves forward, we can make voting easy, but make fraud difficult. So in essence, as we pass a number of pieces of legislation, for those of us whose organizations are on this call, and I think most of the organizations, I'm looking at the list of those who are participating, remember the struggles we had in reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act. But we remember the over 20 hearings that were held in the House and the Senate. We heard from voices of all of our communities about how we can make it better and stronger as we reauthorize, not weakening, but strengthening and improving. And indeed, that's what we did. The big support that came from both the House and the Senate to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was incredible. It was wonderful. It was great to see. We saw that change happening across you have something you want to say? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's the interpreters are rushing to keep
I
up with you.
I got excited.
A bit slower.
I got excited.
I know you do.
Presentation and very good.
It's okay. Happens all the time. Trust me.
I will slow down a bit. The challenge we run into is it's kind of like sprinting through a marathon as we talk about the issues that are before us here today. But let me drop these off because I think what's most important is the kind of questions we can get from our friends in the media as we move things along this way. So we knew we needed to fix the Voting Rights Act. We worked very hard to do. It made no sense in many ways that even the Republican that reauthorization of the last reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act actually said that the Supreme Court had meddled. The Supreme Court did things they shouldn't have done. He still very strongly supported the approach that was taken and was there to actually move through all of the hearings and everything else that was very much a part of things at that time. So let me move to then the other issues. We want to repair the damages done to one of the most successful protections of our voting rights in history. And of course, that is Section 5. It was Section 4B, but it's actually Section 5 that became inoperable. In other words, we decided to strike it altogether for the time being, with the Supreme Court saying that Congress can still do something about it. This is still a problem, but they want us to have more up-to-date hearings, as they said, and a few other things. Well, we began moving that direction, and hopefully it was clear that we were addressing those concerns, and a bill was introduced and supported, initially bipartisan, and then we got into, sadly, some partisan weeds that I believe we can work out. As we move to address the issues of improving our voting system prior to what the Voting Rights Act actually provided for us in terms of protections. We're thinking about ways to make sure that people can register more easily, that indeed people can get to the polls more easily, that we think more about where polling sites are, making them actually even easier to get to for the American people. Because the issue is when anyone says, and I did hear one of our senators in response to Mr. Biden's speech just a couple of days ago, actually say that there were no problems with discrimination and otherwise. I don't know which people he was talking about. But as I think about the NAACP and our 2,000 membership units throughout the country, think about our 500,000 card-carrying members that coordinate voter protection and opportunity. When I think about those who marshaled at the polls in a nonpartisan manner to make sure that everyone that was eligible to vote was able to cast that vote and make sure that vote was counted. When I got the stories back at those that worked so hard, even at a disadvantage of not having one of the provisions in the Voting Rights Act, they made it very clear that it was very difficult. And as much as record numbers turned out and record numbers of votes were counted, record numbers of votes could be argued weren't counted as well. So as we step back and look at what still needs to happen, we want to make sure that we're addressing a number of blockages that we've begun working on even prior to having those crucial provisions struck from their utilization in the Voting Rights Act. We want to make sure that it's easier than ever before for eligible Americans to register and vote. I think as a sideline point, it's an amazing thing that we have some European countries and otherwise that on the date in which you reach the age to be able to vote, you're automatically registered. But if we go back and look at film footage, we'll see that voter registration places, poll sites were actually utilized, and even sheriff's departments were engaged to stop people from coming to the polls to vote. If you look at some of those 1960 shots of the C.T. Vivians of the world, of the Joe Lowrys and so many others that helped lead Americans to those registration sites, you'll see them actually literally being beaten to the ground. Well, we become more sophisticated in our disenfranchisement. We want to make sure that we stop that disenfranchisement all along the way. And that's why we're convinced that a bill named for John Lewis and a bill that speaks for the people are bills that need to pass. We want to make it easier for people to cast those votes. We've seen what happens when you live in an area that the polling place takes you 3 buses to be able to get to. We've seen what happens when polling places are actually moved without giving any additional information about where it is or advanced information, so people don't end up wasting their time and are able to get to work on time, are able to take care of their kids on time and otherwise. We're at the point now where we know that even in America today, if we think about things like the draft, America does not draft, but America still registers for the draft. In other words, our Selective Services Commission actually automatically registers every known 18-year-old at the date they hit their 18th birthday, so that they indeed, on that 18th birthday, should be able to be registered to vote. They should. They can go to war. Why not register to vote so they can actually have a voice in whether America should involve itself in any skirmish, war, or other problems along those lines? So let me say, it's time for us to stop running away from the need to make sure everyone can vote. If I can wake up on the date that I reach voting age in France, I can start voting anytime thereafter. Why shouldn't we be able to do at least the same thing in the land of the free and the home of the brave? So thinking about those who are marginalized, so thinking about even being one of the few countries in the world that actually strips your vote away if you've made the mistake of committing a felony offense, even after you've served the time, even after you've come out in most states. It's an amazing thing when I think about it in those terms, and conversations I had with even Senator Leahy at the time we first talked to him about legislation to repair the damages done to those who have been again paid the debt to society and are out. I asked him to sign on to a bill not knowing that his state was one of the states that doesn't take your right to vote away. Indeed, what he shared with me as he kind of laughed a little bit as we walked across the mall on our way from his office over to the Senate to vote, he laughed a little bit and said, Hillary, look, I'm from a state that we don't take your right to vote away. As a matter of fact, I go into jails, prisons, and otherwise to campaign for even those who have made those mistakes to support an agenda and get to work on those agendas with us. We know that these bills will help move us in that direction as well. We are still part of the country, and one of the things that's very clear about re-implementation of your voting, even after you've committed a crime and made a mistake, is that it is clear that those who are able to vote when they come out are also those that are less likely to go back in. You have a vote, you have a stake. If you have a stake, that means that you too can share how you feel about it and believe that the system is also partially yours as well. It's a democracy after all.
Mr. Shelton, we need to wrap up and go to questions.
Perfect timing. I think I must have read it on your face. Let me just say thank you for the time. We're looking forward to answering any questions you have, but now is the time. We've passed these bills through the House before. There's no reason we can't pass them, both of them through the House and get them through the Senate. Our president, the newly elected president, has already said, there's a place on my desk for these bills. I need the House and Senate to do their work to make sure it gets there so we can sign off on it so the United States can be 100% in favor of every eligible American being able to cast that vote in the great ease that they can, that there is no cheating, and that very well the will of the people in our democracy is what carries the day. Listen, thanks a million. I look forward to our conversation beyond this.
Thanks. All right, okay. Let's see. Let me ask you this. What do you think is the biggest threat in some of the local or state laws that are being passed to African-American voters' access in particular?
Well, they're the seemingly innocuous issues like having to have an official state photo ID. Sounds innocuous because when we think about it, we've seen the example, well, you got to have an ID to get on the plane. There's an exception to that too, by the way, but nonetheless, that's the excuse that's utilized. We know that very well having to have an ID means in some places, people that don't own cars now having to pay an additional expense that would allow them to be able to cast that vote, to be able to have the documentation they need to make sure their voices can be heard as well. I mean, the amazing thing about how that comes across that way is that I had a conversation with Eric Holder at the time that he was the Attorney General of the United States about just this issue. And he turned to me and he said, look, we get what you're saying. Let me just put it in these terms. A poll tax is a poll tax regardless of what you call it. If you have to pay for it, pay extra money to be able to go to the polls and cast that vote. And we know in most states, we're talking about somewhere between $50 and $65 to be able to have that proper ID. That raises some concerns. We've also talked to people that are from states that say that you don't have to pay for it, you just have to get in a special line. Well, we had a couple from Iowa that had just moved to Tennessee. And they talked about how difficult it was for their special needs daughter to get their new ID. They were both retired, but to get their new photo ID so they could begin coming to the polls to vote, they ended up spending 5 hours in that line to get it. And that's only because everyone knew that the governor had promised it. So putting it in those terms, I think there are a number of things that we ran into problems with, making sure the polling sites were eligible, making sure there was easy access to get to those polling sites wherever they may have been, and to make sure there wasn't the erroneous purging that we've seen too often where you get to the polls to cast that vote and they say your name isn't on the list. And they said, well, I know that I'm registered. They said, well, you're going to have to figure out something else to do. I think we need your mic now.
I'm mute. Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Shelton. Stay around for more questions later. And now we welcome our next speaker, Thomas A. Sáenz, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Pilar, and thank you, all of you. It's great to see you again to talk with my colleagues about two very important pieces of federal legislation that would address an ongoing and worsening problem in this country. And for the Latino community that MALDEF represents, this has been a particularly troubling and growing phenomenon. As you all are aware, the growth of the Latino vote is significant in many of the largest states in the country. Latinos are now over 1/4 of registered voters in the state of California, our most populous state. And more importantly, Latinos and the growth of the Latino vote is what has contributed significantly to a shift in the politics of a number of states, beginning with California, which a quarter century ago was viewed as a very much anti-Latino, anti-immigrant state, at least in some of the most notorious ballot measures it had enacted a quarter century ago, including the anti-immigrant Proposition 187, the anti-affirmative action Proposition 209, and the anti-bilingual education Proposition 227. But California politics has changed permanently, as we have seen in the last quarter century, and that has largely been contributed to by the Latino vote. We have seen more recently changes in the states of Arizona and New Mexico, and in the state of Nevada and Colorado. These states have gone from being purple or even red to more consistently blue. These are now states with 2 senators from the Democratic Party each. The big issue, of course, as we know, is that Texas may also flip with the growth of the Latino population. Latinos are now 40% of the population of Texas, our second most populous state, a state that just this week gained 2 more representatives in the House of Representatives, and whose power is only projected to grow in the future. But the growth of Latino participation in elections in Texas is a threat. If Texas flips, like these other states have flipped, the whole calculus of presidential elections will change permanently. That is the threat perceived by certain political forces that are behind efforts to suppress voting by everyone, but particularly in communities of color, and I would say particularly in the Latino community. But we see this even at a more microcosmic level in localities across the country where the Latino community is coming into majority proportions of the vote. This is when leaders seeking to retain power and knowing that they do not have the support of the growing Latino community take steps to suppress the vote, ranging from what we typically see in voter ID provisions, demands that new voter registrants prove their citizenship, all the way to attempts to permit and even facilitate intimidation of voters, which has a particular impact on newer voters, intimidation of voters at the polls. Notoriously, currently pending Texas legislation would permit poll watchers inside of polling places and permit them to take cell phone video of voters who are receiving assistance in the process of voting. That is nothing more than an intimidation tactic. This is a measure of why we need the Congress and President to weigh in to protect us against these depredations of the right to vote. We now have an administration that is supportive of voting rights and facilitating the participation of expanding voter participation in communities like the Latino community. That was not the case before January 20th of this year, as you all are aware, where notoriously President Donald Trump blamed fraudulent Latino voters, non-citizen Latino voters, for his failure to gain a majority of the popular vote in 2016. Most infamously, he created the short-lived voter fraud task force, chaired by the vice president and by Chris Kobach, that ultimately was ended because they could find no proof of voter fraud of any significance across the country. Latinos are often, implicitly or explicitly, those who are accused by leaders like Donald Trump of engaging in voter fraud without a shred of evidence. And so much of the voter suppression legislation we see being proposed and enacted today, whether in Georgia or perhaps soon in Texas, Arizona, and other states, is justified by concerns unsupported by facts about voter fraud. And as often as not, those accusations are directed against the Latino community, which is why MALDEF joins our partners in supporting the enactment of these two important pieces of legislation. And I will conclude by pointing out that in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which we hope will soon be considered in the House of Representatives and then in the Senate, there are important provisions to recognize that we must protect against not only the typical long-standing, huge record vote suppressors in parts of our country, primarily the South, but also including the state of Texas. But we also must anticipate that wherever a new community is reaching critical mass to threaten the powers that be, we need to have in place protections, including pre-clearance review requirements to ensure that these new vote suppressors engaged in voter suppression simply to preserve their own power in the face of a growing communities like the Latino community, like the Asian American community, that we have in place prophylactic measures for those circumstances as well. To put it more colloquially, we need to ensure that we are targeting not just the serial vote killers, but the copycat vote killers as well. And the legislation that is to be considered in Congress would ensure that we do that. So I join my colleagues in working together to get the people whose voices need to be heard to let their representatives know how important these two pieces of legislation, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, are to the future of democracy as our demographics change in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I was just reading a tweet by Arturo Vargas from Naleo yesterday, talking about how the Census Bureau data show that 16.4 million Latinos voted, meaning that 88% of all Latino registered voters went to the polls. So that's pretty successful. Where do you see in these state laws, where do you see the biggest threat for Latinos?
Certainly, that is, first of all, a tremendous indication of success that should be celebrated. But we still in the Latino community, as you know, face lower levels of registration, so that as a percentage of all eligible voters, we are still behind. And those are among the reasons we have to facilitate registration and the actual casting of ballots in the Latino community. But to your question, I am particularly concerned, in addition to the concerns that have already been articulated about things like voter ID provisions, restrictions on registration, moving of precincts without adequate notice or provision to allow remote voting or access to the polls. But I am particularly concerned for the Latino community about voter intimidation. The history of voter intimidation that targets Latinos is unfortunately deep and rich. We've seen it going back decades, whether that's the posting of armed, uniformed guards at polling places designed to intimidate, particularly newer voters, or the provision I mentioned in the Texas legislation that would permit poll watchers to enter the polling place itself and to take video of those who are voting. That is nothing more than an attempt to intimidate particularly new voters from even going to the polls in the first place. And if you add to that restrictions on remote voting, they are taking steps to really staunch participation, particularly of new voters, and that's a danger to the Latino community. The last thing I'll say is tied to that is a need to facilitate and permit assistance to voters who need it. Now, that may be based on disability, that may be based on language, that may be based on other factors, but we need to permit folks who need assistance to have that assistance. And MALDEF, for example, right now is challenging an Arkansas law that restricts the number of people that you can assist in casting a vote. there should be no such restriction.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Quickly, there is a question regarding what's going on in Arizona, an election audit going on there that is suspect and not transparent. How do organizations work to stop such audits from happening in other states?
So the audit is based on the falsehood of voter fraud. You don't need audits unless you have some suspicion, well supported, of voter fraud. There is no such suspicion to support an audit in Arizona. But the lack of transparency, as you mentioned in the question, is a major problem, because that's where we end up with false narratives about supposed voter fraud. So we need to make sure through pressure and demands that our policy making be based on fact, not on fiction, that it be based on documented fact, and that the documentation of those facts happen in a transparent and public fashion. We have nothing to fear about ensuring that there is no voter fraud. We do not need to be afraid of audits that are open, but where they are going to be taken in a way that is not open and public, that is to produce false narrative, and we must ensure that we are against and taking steps to ensure that false narratives do not get perpetuated further.
Thank you, Tom. Let's move on to our next speaker, and that is Jacqueline De Leon, staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Ethnic Media and the Leadership Conference for organizing this event. As mentioned, my name is Jacqueline De Leon. I'm a member of the Ysleta Pueblo, and I'm a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, known as NARF, the nation's largest and oldest nonprofit law firm dedicated to advancing the rights of Native Americans. Thank you for listening today about the pressing need to pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Native people across the country face unreasonable barriers to the ballot box and overt discrimination that makes it too difficult for them to participate in American democracy. As background, in 2018, the Native American Voting Rights Coalition, led by NARF, completed a series of 9 field hearings across Indian country. We heard from approximately 125 witnesses, generating thousands of pages of transcripts about voting in federal and state elections. Our findings are extensively documented in a report released in June of 2020, Obstacles at Every Turn, Barriers to Political Participation Faced by Native Americans, which can be found at vote.narf.org. NARF has also successfully brought a number of seminal Native American voting rights cases in the last 4 years, including challenges to North Dakota's voter ID law, a challenge to Montana's ballot collection ban, a challenge to Alaska's witness signature requirement during a pandemic, and a 2020 lawsuit challenging, lost my place for a second there, the refusal to open an in-person polling location on the Blackfeet Reservation. In that case, county officials were given the option of all mail-in voting because of the pandemic, and Pend Oreille County chose to keep in-person voting at their county seat, which ensured access for the over 90% white residents, but denied in-person voting to Blackfeet tribal members who do not get mail delivered to their homes and who would have had to travel 120 miles to vote. Only after we sued did the county agree to on-reservation voting access. Relying upon the 14th and 15th Amendments and the VRA, Native American voters have filed nearly 100 lawsuits with a success rate of over 90%. These cases have been litigated in front of judges appointed by Republican and Democratic presidents, and yet the overwhelming fact patterns compel relief. In short, the facts are so bad we nearly always win. But litigation is a blunt and expensive instrument, and much of this litigation could have been avoided if the For the People Act and John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act had been in effect. Today, many Native American reservations are rural, distant from the nearest off-reservation border town because of official policies to forcibly remove and segregate them on remote and undesirable land. travel to voting services, DMVs, and post offices can be hundreds of miles away. Due to ongoing discrimination and governmental neglect, many Native Americans live in overcrowded homes that do not have addresses, do not receive mail, and are located on dirt roads that can be impassable in wintry November. There are Native Americans today that cannot access basic government services. The need for federal action is urgent and compelling. This year, legislators in states across the country are capitalizing upon these vulnerabilities and making it unreasonably difficult for Native Americans to vote. NARF is monitoring over 100 discriminatory bills introduced in 14 states with sizable Native American populations. Arizona in particular has taken advantage of the suspension of Section 5, introducing at least 27 proposed bills that make it too hard for Natives to vote. Montana,
Jacqueline, remember the interpreters? Remember
Oh,
the
sorry.
interpreters? So go a little slower and finish in about 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay. Montana just passed a ballot collection ban in defiance of a state court ruling we secured just last year that its previous ballot collection ban made it too difficult for Native Americans that do not have mail delivery to vote. A fully functioning Voting Rights Act would force objective review of these laws. Instead, NARF is preparing for costly and time-consuming litigation. Finally, in case there's any doubt that Native Americans face overt discrimination on the basis of race, NARF has collected extensive evidence of the racism faced by Native American voters. For example, this past election, the weekend before Election Day, a man won the local costume contest in a town bordering the Fort Peck Reservation. He was dressed in full Ku Klux Klan attire. As a tribal member relayed to me, this is why satellite voting sites are so important for our tribal members. Not everyone is comfortable going into places in Glasgow, and not everyone in Glasgow is going to make our tribal members feel welcome. These racist attitudes are not just the work of private individuals. Voting officials also discriminate against Native Americans. Less than 10 years ago in South Dakota, Native American voters were degraded and forced to vote out of a chicken coop. In Wisconsin, voters were forced to vote where the sheriff's office was, and patrol cars were checking the plates of every car leaving the reservation on Election Day, intimidating voters. In 2018, a San Juan County clerk in Utah committed fraud to kick the Native American candidate off of the ballot, who was only reinstated after a federal court ordered it. Overt discrimination remains a present-day problem in need of present-day solutions. We need federal action to make it easier and more equitable for Native Americans to vote. And we need federal review of laws passed by state legislators intent on keeping Native Americans from political participation and power. The For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act are important steps to ensure fair and full access for every American citizen, including Native Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And because of time, I'm just going to go to our fourth speaker, and then there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll address to everyone. The next speaker is Wendy Weiser, Vice President, Democracy of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you, Pilar. And so such an honor to be here today with all of you. Again, my name is Wendy Weiser. I'm with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. We are a nonpartisan think tank and public interest law center that focuses on fundamental issues of democracy and justice. And in particular, we work to expand access to the franchise and protect every eligible American's right and freedom to vote. And so I'm going to bring it home with two bills that we think are critical to protecting those freedoms and that right. And they're both bills that have deep ties to the late, great Representative John Lewis, the one named for him, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and one that he was a principal drafter and champion of, which is the For the People Act. Both of these bills are critical to stopping the scourge of vote suppression that is facing our country today and to protecting the freedom to vote going forward. And just to remind you of the context that we are in right now, voting rights in America are under attack like they haven't been since the Jim Crow era. The Brennan Center has been tracking legislation to restrict access to voting for over a decade. And it is the push to restrict access to voting in state legislatures is unprecedented in this time period in terms of both volume and intensity. As of a month ago, and we have a new count coming out soon, it is not yet ready, but as of a month ago, there were more than 360 bills to roll back voting rights pending in 47 states. That is a dramatic increase over any year beforehand. And these bills have been moving aggressively through the legislature. They would roll back voting rights in a number of ways. You've heard some examples, so I'm not going to go through them now, but they have already been signed into law in 6 states. And just yesterday, the Florida legislature sent a 7th bill to the governor's desk for signature. So we are going to have 7 significant bills, vote suppression bills, having passed in this short period of time. And there are more bills that are aggressively moving through state legislatures in Arizona, Texas, Michigan, New Hampshire, and about a dozen other states right now. They all have the potential to dramatically reduce voting access, especially for voters of color, and they all disproportionately affect and often target voters of color. And increasingly, those who are pushing these measures are saying that quiet part out loud, acknowledging that the goal of these measures is to subtract voters from the electorate. No pretextual justification is being provided in many cases anymore. And you all, I'm sure, heard the Arizona legislator who made headlines when he said that he didn't think everybody should vote and that quantity is important, but we have to look at quality as well. These kinds of statements are more and more common. It is obviously wrong. And this is not both not what our law allows for and not what our country is about. Congress can and must stop this legislative campaign across the country to suppress the vote. And it is emphatically has the power to do so under the Constitution. And there are some very strong provisions. The Constitution's elections clause empowers Congress to rewrite state election laws or election laws as it applies to federal elections. It's been described by the US Supreme Court, by all the justices, as an incredibly broad power. And the 14th and 15th Amendment, the Reconstruction clauses, also give Congress very strong powers to remedy and deter and prevent race discrimination in the voting process. Now, the Brennan Center, my organization, has analyzed each and every one of the restrictive voting bills that have been, the laws that have passed and the bills that are pending across the country. And we have found that both the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would thwart virtually every single one. And I'm going to start with the For the People Act, where bills seek to cut back, for example, on who could vote by mail. The For the People Act would require all states to offer no excuse absentee balloting and eliminating barriers to casting mail ballots and to having those ballots counted, where bills would ban automatic or same-day voter registration. The For the People Act would protect and expand those nationally, where bills would cut early voting on Sundays or sharply limit when and where that could take place. The For the People Act would require 14 days of consecutive early voting, including weekends and evenings, where bills would sharply limit the number of ballot drop boxes, like Florida just passed and Georgia. The For the People Act would require every state to make available an adequate number of drop boxes keyed to the population in each jurisdiction and so forth. More broadly, the For the People Act would set a national standard for voting access that every American can rely on and that legislatures can't manipulate for discriminatory reasons or partisan gain. So in addition to those items, a couple of other key things: it would restore voting rights to every American with past criminal convictions once they are living in the community. It would expand election security and access for voters with disabilities. It would ban partisan gerrymandering and set clear rules for the drawing of congressional districts. It would curb the role of big money in politics, not only requiring disclosure and enforcement, but also enacting a system of voluntary small donor public matching funds, which has been really valuable in many jurisdictions across the country to increase the diversity of candidates and to broaden who can participate in the financing of our elections. And it would also strengthen rules to ensure ethical conduct by executive and judicial branch officials. So every single one of these measures is drawing on successful policies at the national, state, and local level that are already in place, that have been honed by election officials over years, that have been supported by members and officials of both political parties in the past. And they are wildly popular with the public. And so those are baseline national rules for all Americans, but that is not enough, because even with those national rules, there are still going to be efforts to discriminatorily target voters based on their race. The ingenuity of people who are trying to reduce access to voting can't all be predicted in advance and is not going to all be covered by the provisions and the very broad and sweeping provisions in the For the People Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would thwart all of the pending bills to the extent they are discriminatory and would prevent future changes to voting laws that discriminate on the basis of race. And it does so in kind of two broad ways. It would restore the requirement that certain states and localities with a history of voting discrimination get prior federal approval or pre-clearance of any changes to their voting rules and practices to make sure that those are not discriminatory. And it would require all jurisdictions in the country with significant minority populations to submit for pre-clearance any changes to that are of a list of covered practices like strict voter ID laws or polling place closures in communities of colors that have been typically implemented for discriminatory purpose or have typically had significant discriminatory effects. So these are the two key pieces of federal legislation that taken together have all the key reforms that we need to protect voting rights and strengthen democracy in America. And I'm happy to answer questions about them.
Okay, thank you so much, Wendy. That was very helpful. I got a question for Jacqueline via text. Jacqueline, where is native vote on the rise and where could it disrupt the power balance?
Yeah, so I think native vote is actually on the rise across the country due to dedicated GOTV activists, but they're facing, a lot of suppressive efforts to undermine their successful efforts. We saw them come out really strongly in Arizona for the registered voters, but as Tom mentioned, there's a big gap between registered voters and still the number of possible voters. So there's still a lot of votes out there to get, but they do have strong turnout in Arizona. We've seen tribes make the difference in elections in Alaska, in North Dakota, Wisconsin, and in Montana as well. Those are just some of the states. Michigan are other places where Native American vote can tip the balance.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to merge into one, and I'm going to address it to Wendy, but after she answers, anyone else that, any other panelists can add anything. So the biggest, the challenge is to pass these laws in the Senate, in particular, where you would need Republicans because the filibuster is still with us. So, and there is also a question on how Senators Manchin and Sinema will act. So what can our communities do? And this comes from my colleague, Anthony Advincula. What can our communities do to persuade a bipartisan agreement on these bills? Can we actually reach that? Wendy, anyone else?
So I'll start with that. And I think that it's important to note that actually all of these voting measures in the American public and in the states have broad bipartisan support. There are certainly challenges in the Congress, but it's also important to note that the Voting Rights Act has long been a bipartisan piece of legislation and that has been passed again and again with substantial bipartisan support. Last time in 2006, when it was reauthorized, it was unanimous in the Senate and close to unanimous in the House, was signed into law by then President George W. Bush. So it has a long history of bipartisan support. So there still is, I think, some hope that there will get to 60, or that there will get substantial bipartisan support, and frankly, both the House and Senate. And I think that all of your communities should be demanding that kind of support for both bills from Republican and Democratic lawmakers alike, because the right to vote, the freedom to vote no party has a monopoly on that, and no party should be for restricting that. I will add that the getting through the filibuster isn't the only way of passing it. You know, there have been a lot of discussions of ways in which the filibuster can be, there can be exceptions made to the filibuster for particular pieces of legislation or classes of legislation, including legislation that impacts voting rights. And that has also been discussed on the table. I know that there has been actually many senators have expressed an openness to this. I think Senator Manchin has expressed some openness, and then has more recently expressed less openness to this. I think that right now the strategy is to get as broad a bipartisan support as possible. But I think that the right to vote and our democracy is too urgent to be held hostage to this 60 vote requirement into any rule. And so if that can't be accomplished, then those senators need to be urged to give up their allegiance to this longstanding Jim Crow relic, at least for these critical voting bills.
Okay, so for the last round, and we need to close pretty soon, I'll go back to in the order of speakers, and I will ask that you say whatever last words you want to say, but also that you address how ethnic media can help provide the information needed for audiences to understand the importance of these bills. Mr. Yang?
Sure, and I think for ethnic media to explain how important these are in just our common day people, especially for the Asian American, Latino communities that have language access issues, this will help. And making sure that they understand sort of how this applies in the real world sense, that is going to be critical. The other piece, going to what Wendy is saying, is that this is something that the American people find to be popular, independent of the partisan politics. The right to vote, the freedom to vote, is fundamental to our democracy. It should not be a partisan issue that we want to have more people voting. That is fundamental to democracy. If we continue to reiterate that message, then we might be able to get to a different space.
Mr. Shelton. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. It's always great. Yeah. It's always great being on a Zoom like this with your friends, because in DC terms, I can simply associate myself with the comments of my colleagues, and John has begun wearing this out just fine, putting it out all on the table. So the most important thing, I think, is they see the disaggregated problem of how these issues hit us in our communities, how the democratic system works. And that is that if you don't have the voices there speaking from the issues and challenges, you'll get left out, locked out, and knocked down every time. But also even comparing that to what happens when we turn out in record numbers. We turned out in record numbers in 2008, our votes were counted, even with the number of challenges there and whatnot as well. And as things went, when we look at the agenda that followed, the kind of judges that were put in place, when we look at the kind of members of the administration that were actually put in place as well, their values reflect the values of those who vote. On the other side of the equation, when our votes are not counted, when we are locked out of that process, when our voices are not heard, we end up with problems that make conditions even much more difficult for us than ever before. So that being said, tell the story is what we ask to our friends in the media, and make sure they understand how this impacts each of our communities. There's a lot of similarity in how it affects us, all those of us representing the communities we do on this call. But there are also a lot of things we have to see that are unique to our communities. It's sad that the uniqueness that we share is the uniqueness of being locked out, disqualified, and disenfranchised. We want to make sure those voices are heard clearly, and we count on you to do. As a matter of fact, we will give you our cell number.
Okay, there you go. There's the chat. You can put it there. Okay,
Absolutely.
Tom, it's your turn.
I would just add, as journalists, of course, you report facts. And I think the most important thing you can do is report the facts about non-existent voter fraud. There are those who will assert that you're being biased when you point out the fact is there is no evidence of significant voter fraud, but that is in itself a false narrative. It is unbiased, objective journalism to report that there is no factual evidence to support the allegations of widespread voter fraud that are behind so many of these measures. And the other area where I think you can help to get the facts out is about filibuster. Lots of people make assumptions about filibuster, but filibuster at bottom exists to protect minority political views. I don't mean minority in the sense of demographics. I mean in the sense of these are views of folks that are not aligned with the views of the majority. The Senate itself is designed to protect minority by having small states get the same number of senators too as our largest, most populous states. And you layer on top of that a filibuster requirement, it's protection of minority political views on top of protection of minority political views. And getting those facts out allows us to discuss whether that kind of overprotection, if you will, of the political views that are not supported by the majority should ever be used to prevent an expansion of voter participation by communities of color.
Thank you, Tom. Jacqueline DeLeon.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's wonderful to be among all these amazing panelists. And I just want to urge the media to remember that in Indian country, overt discrimination, overt racism is still existing. Native Americans are still facing election officials that are unabashedly discriminating against them on the basis of their race and making it more difficult for them to vote because they fear their political power. And so, you know, it truly is a resurgence of the Jim Crow era across the board, but in Indian country, Jim Crow never left. We still have, you know, first generation barriers that are making it unreasonably difficult for Native Americans to cast their ballot. Native Americans that are American citizens like everyone else. And so we just, you know, appreciate you spreading that message, you know, as along with the other messages of voter suppression. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Last word.
So I agree with everything my co-panelists say and would add, I think we're going to be entering into a renewed period of intense disinformation about the voting process. You might be following a somewhat controversial audit going on in Arizona of the election results, disinformation of these pieces of federal legislation, disinformation about the impact of these bills and now laws to restrict access to voting. And so I do think getting the facts straight is going to be critical. And I guess the last thing is fighting cynicism. I think that we've learned in the last year that a lot of things are possible that we didn't previously think are possible. And the fact that these voting and democracy reform provisions are at the top of the agenda for the Congress, you know, shows that this is not just such an important issue, but that it's possible. And so we should treat it as such. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Sandy?
I think these speakers really brought home such an important political trend that often gets lost amidst the pandemic and the debates about COVID, that our voting rights and our freedom to vote is at great peril. And thank you so much for explaining that and spotlighting two efforts to really make sure we stand our ground. Very appreciative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.